Magnificent Obsession by Lloyd C. Douglas. Chapter 4. As old Nicholas rose from the table that Saturday night, he said no more to his tall grandson than to himself, "I'm glad I could live until now." The past 8 years had been dreadfully unhappy for him. It was not that there had been fresh reasons for unhappiness, but leisure to realize how much of life's solider satisfactions he had missed. From his teens until his retirement from the business he had organized, Merrick's consuming passion had been concerned with the development of a great industry, an enterprise singularly difficult in that it lacked the natural guidance of established precedents. There were rules to be made for it, but none to be followed. It was a business without an ancestry. Men who dealt with any product in the field of ceramics had thousands of years of good tradition back to them. Weavers, tanners, jewelers, masons, builders of houses, ships, cathedrals, growers of grain, fruit, cattle. These people could plot their economic curve and determine future policies by past experience. It was not so of motors. The rise of that industry had been meteoric, dramatic. A prosperous young bicycle factory turned its attention to the experimental manufacture of a horseless carriage as a tentative sideline. Young Merrick stockholders were frankly skeptical of the venture in the face of public hilarity over the noisy, undependable, cumbersome, dangerous gasoline buggy. And then, one day, the power-driven vehicle was suddenly an accepted fact, but the distance between the fox-statured Eopus and the draft horse was no wider than that of the evil-smelling little rattletrap of an automobile when Nicholas Merrick first made its acquaintance, and the strong, swift, silent, streamlined motor car which eventually developed. Its evolution involved hazards as foolhardy as investments at Monte Carlo. A bewildering succession of revolutionizing inventions made the business over, again and again, while investors wrung their hands and shrieked discordant counsel into the ears of apprehensive directors. Costly machinery installed yesterday would be scrapped today to be replaced by costlier tomorrow. Those were days when the man who bore the final responsibility for such a chaotic enterprise found that 24 hours devotion to business was demanded by this unprecedented industry. Plunging impetuously over an uncharted course, narrowly skirting ruin every few weeks, and turning sharp corners every day. Responsive to general clamor, prophetic of great fortunes to be made, innumerable companies hastily entered the motor market where competition became merciless, unscrupulous. Disaster was inevitable for all but a few of the keenest, the bravest, the luckiest. Merrick experienced all the anxiety of a pioneer leading a long wagon train of scared immigrants across a trackless desert without a compass. For fully 30 years, but little of his time or thought had been deflected from his exacting responsibility. When, therefore, at 72, he wearily dismounted from the tiger he had ridden, an event which called for a brilliant complimentary banquet at the Chamber of Commerce in the suburban town of Axion. He was a very tired old man, with a fortune estimated at 20 millions, a high blood pressure, and a large stock of disquieting memories. Cliff. God, what a tragedy. Cliff's mother, a timid, brown thrush of a woman, had died when the boy was 12. Nicholas had scarcely missed her. They had built the big shops that year. He saw little of the boy. Occasionally there would be a brief and stormy session. Nicholas violently hortatory, Clifford calmly insolent, but nothing ever came of it beyond estrangement. Nobody could say he had not done his utmost to surround his son with opportunities. Surely, if money could have done it, Cliff had a chance. Nicholas had always silenced his own misgivings with that reply. God knows I've spent enough on him. I can't nurse him myself. But now, that enforced idleness had brought opportunity for serious reflection. Nicholas milled it all over, elbows on knees, empty hands dangling. The old alibi was no good. Nor was there any reasonable expectation of better things to be expressed by the new generation. Bobby was a lovable youngster, to be sure. Nicholas rejoiced in his steady wit, his winning smile, his unfailing consideration of his grandfather's moods, but he gave no promise of success. Beyond the fact that he played the piano like a professional artist, possessed an unusual capacity for making and retaining friendships, and had contrived to finish his college course, Bobby held out no encouragement that he would ever do anything worth a thought. He would drive and drink, gamble and golf, hunt and fish, marry some dizzy, dissipated, scarlet-lipped little flapper and tire ever. He would summer in Canada, winter in Cannes, clip his coupons, confer with his tailor, subsidize the symphony orchestra, appear on the stationery of a few charities, and on the platform when the Republican candidate for president came to town, and ultimately be pushed into the crypt in a big, echoing Gothic mausoleum alongside Clifford, the waster. Oh, there had been an occasional ray of hope, a mere phosphorescence, just enough to make the darkness a little more dense when the flash was over. On the last day of his grandson's senior year, it was a mid-year class with ceremonies deferred until commencement, Nicholas had driven over to the little city of the State University, lunching with his old-time friend, the head of the Department of Chemistry. He had straightened and beamed when Professor Garland said, I don't know whether you're aware of it, Merrick, but that wild young cub of yours has the making of a chemist. Honest? Speak to him about it, won't you, Garland? It would mean more, coming from you. Garland had made it a lengthy rite of mixing his tea and hot water before relying. Chemistry's hard work, old chap. Your boy knows he doesn't have to work. And when Nicholas's face fell, Garland added consolingly, You can't blame him. Why would he put on a rubber apron and puddle in nasty stews and noxious stinks when he can get some joy out of life? Tonight, a great weight had been lifted from old Nicholas. He had not been prepared for the news of his good fortune, and though his spirit sang, his sagging soldiers testified to the gravity of the load he had now thrown off. He laid a brown, parchment-colored hand affectionately on Bobby's arm, and together they sauntered from the dining room into the spacious library. This was the old man's sanctuary. The walls were covered, literally, from walnut-beamed ceiling to Chinese rug, with cases filled with unexcelled and unexplored classic literature. The mental pabulum on which Nicholas fed these days consisted for the most part of mystery stories strangely alike in plot and technique. It was not that Nicholas had no mind for better reading. It was only that he was tired of thinking. They strolled into the library, and the weary old fellow sank with a sigh into the depths of his favorite chair. A gaudy, jacketed detective story lay face downward on the table. Bobby took it up, read its title aloud, and grinned. Light, Grandpierre? He offered a flame at the tip of the old man's cigar. Exciting yarn? Nicholas puffed energetically for a moment, like a leaky bellows, and replied, The inspector is just questioning the cook, Bobby, and she says she knows the shot was fired at exactly 11:10 because this is the time she always puts out the cat. You should be pretty well acquainted with the kitchen habits of that cook by this time, Grandpierre. It's the same one, isn't it, in all these stories?
By no means, sir, protested Nicholas. The last cook was a man.
Bobby was restless to be by himself and eager to divert his grandfather to his novel so that he might escape. The emotional strain of the past hour had been decidedly wearing. The confidence he had extended to the old man represented many days of serious thought, and nights, too, when he had paced his room for hours, considering his tentative decision from every possible angle of objection. Now that he had resolved upon his course, it was only fair that he should inform his grandfather. He had done so. He had made a conscious effort to avoid a dramatic moment. He hated scenes. He had been brought up on them. But old Nicholas had passed through quite too much despair and anxiety not to be raised to an exalted mood by the young fellow's calm announcement of a program committing him to a task at once expensively sacrificial and, as to duration, interminable. For a moment, after Bobby had flung out the words, the old man had sat stupefied and incredulous. He had put down his fork. His jaw sagged and his chin chopped up and down as if in a shaking palsy. The deep wrinkles about his mouth had joined the wrinkles about his eyes in a series of half circles, and he peered across the table. He dug his gnarled old fingers into the snowy cloth, rested his weight on his elbows, and demanded in a rasping treble,
"How's that, Robert? I don't believe I caught what you just said. Say that again."
Bobby had said it again, slowly, calmly, convincingly. Old Nicholas's seamed face twitched, and he rubbed the corners of his cavernous eyes with the back of his mottled hand.
"You are a brave boy," he said, his voice breaking.
Then, ashamed of his weakness, he violently cleared his throat, straightened his back, and declared with dignity,
"I congratulate you, sir. I cannot remember when any member of my tribe has made a decision of greater moment than yours. May God bless you."
The benediction was spoken with a quaver. It was almost too much for both of them. For an hour thereafter, Bobby had outlined his future plans with a breadth and scope and clarity of detail, certifying to the vast amount of time and thought he had spent on them. The old man following every word with eager nods of his leonine head and occasional hard bangings of his fist upon the table to emphasize his approval.
"Yes, sir!" he would shout tumultuously. "You can do it! You will do it! You have it in you! I always thought you had!"
His mood was reminiscent of the good old days when it required a deal of table-pounding to convince the directors that a radical and immediate change of policy was necessary to meet new conditions, no matter what it cost. Now the first tidal wave of enthusiasm had broken and surfed. Bobby wanted the subject temporarily dismissed. He had lived with his problem, eaten it, dreamed it, walked the floor with it, gone to the mat with it, cajoled it, cursed it, for a month. And having now brought it to something like climax, he was ready to see it tabled. Sensing his grandson's restlessness as he stood toying with the paperweight, Nicholas deliberately located his place in the book, meticulously polished his glasses, and smiled a very obvious adieu. "Think I'll step out for a little stroll, if you're up to reading, Grandpierre," said Bobby. Nicholas nodded several times, puffed noisily, contentedly, buried himself in his story. Immediately Bobby's back was turned, however, he put down the book and stared after the receding figure, his old eyes wide with a new interest to which he had not yet become accustomed. Bobby looked back as he passed through the doorway and grinned. Nicholas caught up his book frowned heavily over some abstruse passage he had just come upon, and puffed mightily on his long cigar. Changing his pumps for tennis shoes and his dinner coat for a light sweater, Bobby let himself out through the carriage door upon the driveway. There was a half moon and an unclouded sky and a few fireflies. He trudged aimlessly on the drive, left it for the grass, wandered along the narrow path by the rose arbor, found himself near the huge twin pillars of the gate, strolled out upon the highway. It was not a busy thoroughfare, but a narrow, graveled motor road, serving chiefly the widely spaced country estates fronting on the western shore of the lake. It was very quiet tonight. Hands in pockets, head tilted forward in moody meditation, he strode along indifferent to his random journey, his eyes becoming accommodated to the gloom. He was glad he had told his grandfather. Tomorrow he would drive down to Brightwood and tell Nancy Ashford. It was like having strong anchors to windward that these two people should share his secret. He hoped Nancy Ashford would be content to say, "Very proper, much as I expected," and let it go at that. He wasn't much of a success in moments crammed with sentimentality. It was all right in the case of Grandpierre, of course. He was an old man, and a bit mellow. But he hoped Nancy would be sensible. Bobby had walked a mile. 100 yards ahead of him, at a sharp bend of the road, a pair of glaring headlights, tilted at a precarious angle, indicated that a car had listed heavily to starboard. In the ditch, he surmised. He heard the sudden churning of the motor, as power was violently applied to impotent wheels. Green driver, he reflected. Again the roar of the straining motor proclaimed that somebody was making a bad matter no better. Fool, he muttered, and quickened his steps. Evidently the driver had sighted him, and unsure of his intentions, was making a final effort at extrication before he reached the car, for as he came within a few feet, the engine fairly bellowed with exasperation as the big coupe shuddered. There was a young woman at the wheel. "My God, sister!" shouted Bobby when the racket had subsided. "Don't do that any more!" Sister accepted the admonition with wide eyes into which Bobby now gazed interestedly at close range. She smiled, and he reconsidered his earlier opinion on her. She was probably unaccustomed to driving in soft gravel, unacquainted with its treacheries. Might be a most excellent driver almost anywhere else. "Is it really down very deep?" she inquired, with anxiety. There was a curious huskiness in her voice, and gave it an intimate, just-between-us confidential timbre. Bobby walked to the rear and looked. "Very," he declared. "To the hub. Your differential is flat on the ground." Her face was perplexed. "I don't know what that is," she admitted, "but I'm sure it shouldn't be." "No," said Bobby paternally. "They do better when they're up off the road." She sighed, dabbed at a warm neck with a trifle of lace. "It's my fault, I suppose," ruefully. "I was driving rather fast, and at that sharp turn a car came whopping toward me with the sort of lights they use on aviation fields. I turned out, slipped off." "And here you are," finished Bobby. "Lucky you didn't upset. You might have been badly hurt." She searched his shadowed face, slightly stirred by the note of concern for her safety. Might be safer without it. What she saw caused her no anxiety. "Well, at least we have no broken bones to worry about. All I have to do now is get this car back on the road. Anything to suggest? I'm awfully helpless about such things, not meaning," she added quickly, "that I'm in the habit of ditching my car." "I'm sure you're not," said Bobby, encouragingly. "This gravel is very slippery." "What do you think I'd better do?" she asked, in a tone that quite relinquished all further responsibility into his hands. It was as if she had leaned her slight weight against him. For the past half-hour he had been thinking himself the loneliest, most utterly detached person on earth. His important resolution had quite cut him off from his habitual round of interests. but had not yet keyed him on to any new ones. Nobody had ever been so desperately in need of friendship. He rested an elbow on the ledge of the open window and became whimsically didactic. In cases like this, when the local power plant is proved insufficient, it is customary to seek aid. One calls in the neighbors. They, having suspected all along that their services might be required, have gone early to bed, and must be pounded out with loud noises and an offer of a king's ransom. Having bathed, shaved, dressed, and breakfasted, they come, growling with a snorting tractor, and when they're ready to pull, the tow line breaks, and they must drive their tractor to town for another.
Something like that, agreed Bobby.
Your advice seems clear, she said, matching his mood. First, one goes for the neighbors.
She tallied the items on her fingers.
But which one?
Which one of the neighbors? Bobby countered with a chuckle. Or which one of us? I'll go, of course, gladly, but, he added commandingly, you're coming along. I won't have you out here alone in a stalled car. It was spoken spontaneously. Doubtless it meant nothing more than an unintentionally peremptory way of saying he considered it unsafe for her to be left by herself on this unfrequented road. But the fervent phrasing of it, the implied possessorship he had put into his "I won't have you out here alone," brought her a queer sensation. Nobody had ever used precisely that tone with her before. She felt, well, as if she were being absorbed, ever so little, just the tiniest mite of her, like the first almost invisible trickle of fine sand pouring through the needle-slim neck of an hourglass. Nothing to be alarmed about, surely. She could easily enough reverse the glass whenever she wished. For the moment, it was not unpleasant to just let it run, just for the novelty of it. It wouldn't be much. She would see to that. In a half hour, she and this delightful chap, with a clean-cut profile that might have graced a Grecian coin, would go their ways. If it pleased him to issue orders, she would humor him by coming to attention and clicking her heels. Bobby opened the door, offered his hand. She took it without hesitation and stepped out upon the road.
Should I have locked the gears?
She asked. No, drawled Bobby. It'll be here when we come back. They both laughed. Leaving the highway, they entered a thickly hedged narrow lane, cut through a dense track of tall firs.
I hope you know where we're going,
she said, as Bobby strode forward. Can't say that I do, he confessed. I never was in here before, but I think it must be the private road to the Foster estate. Doubtless we will find one of the farmers' cottages presently. The girl trudged along beside him, taking 2 steps to his one on high heels not meant for hiking in country lanes. A sheep scuttled out of the left hedge and dashed frantically across the road a few feet ahead of them. Instinctively, she caught at Bobby's sleeve.
Oh, but that startled me.
Here, take my hand. It was a small hand that she gave him, and he held it as if he were leading a little child. Absurd as he was bound to admit it, his attitude toward her was proprietary, and incautious as she knew it to be, her response to it was spontaneous. She had a sensation that just the smallest imaginable emanation of herself was being quietly assimilated by the strong fingers of this dominating boy. Mentally, Bobby tightened his grip. Physically, he led her as one would a younger sister.
We might encounter all sorts of adventures, she suggested. Suppose we ran into a nest of counterfeiters.
There aren't any counterfeiters anymore, scoffed Bobby. They're all bootlegging. More profits, less risk.
Oh, how I hate it, she cried passionately. What a vulgar, beastly thing it's come to be. It never concerned me one way or the other, until lately. But now, it's destroying my best friend.
Bobby was annoyed at this sudden stab of jealousy. But what right had he to be jealous? I have a good reason to hate it, too, he rejoined bitterly, adding with a growl, but I believe I've got it licked.
Oh, I hope so,
she exclaimed with a quick intake of breath.
It would be such a pity.
Her sentence hung, suspended, and for some time neither spoke. That's the first time anybody ever said to me that it would be a pity. So, the time had come now to reverse the glass. She would do it at once, presently, but not abruptly. How did one upend an hourglass gradually, imperceptibly, she wondered. Perhaps the proper technique would occur to her. Meantime, the silence was lengthening, and silence, at this juncture, was disturbing. You knew it without being told, didn't you?
I'm not sure that I did. It wouldn't have mattered much to anybody.
How silly. No one concerned whether you fling yourself away? It did sound melodramatic, didn't it? As if I wanted to play Orphan Annie.
You've been rather down, haven't you? Careful, careful.
That glass couldn't be upended by any such process as this. Horribly. But I'm not now.
That's good. Fresh grip?
Neither of them knew just why there was a momentarily tightening of their hand clasp. Naturally, the word suggested it. The sudden pressure of his fingers about her hand was but an affirmative, perhaps an acknowledgment of her encouragement, and her quick response was a mere friendly note of confidence to a fellow human who had been down and was now on the way up. But each was aware and intuitively conscious that the other was aware of a compact, a curiously indefinable sense of belonging. She released her hand a moment later and instantly realized it was the wrong thing to have done. The withdrawal only seemed to be a retreat after an avowal. More than that, it hadn't come about nearly so cautiously as it should. Her fingers had slipped slowly out of his hand, detained ever so slightly by his lingering pressure. So she had turned the glass, had she?
Oh, I see a light, she cried, in a window.
With droll predictions of the manner of welcome they might receive, they quickened their steps and presently knocked at the door. A farmer opened it, stood framed in a glow of an acetylene lamp suspended from the ceiling. Two small children hugged a leg apiece, registering curiosity. After a brief parley, the man retreated for his cap, joined the pair outside, told them he'd be along soon, and went for his tractor. Bobby made no attempt to resume the conversation interrupted by the sighting of the cottage. He took his new friend's small hand, however, as they turned to retrace their steps, and tucked it under his arm. She gave it without shyness. "You'll be going back to college, I expect?" he hazarded.
No, not this year. And you?
"Oh, I'm through," said Bobby, maturely. "Beginning my professional course in a few days."
Law, maybe?
"Is that what you would pick for me?" She laughed.
I think I should know a bit more about you before I selected your profession.
Well, if you were a man?
I should go in for surgery.
Any special kind?
Yes,
she replied, with a quick decision.
I would be a brain surgeon.
That's odd.
Why?
Her question went unanswered. The noisy tractor was overtaking them. They were near the highway, and the conversation gave way to business at hand. After maneuvering into position, the farmer was ready. Bobby took the wheel of the coupe, its owner waiting at a discreet distance until the car should be tugged back upon the road. It was simply done, but the emergency driver of the coupe stammered something about the possibility that the steering apparatus might be in need of inspection. Sometimes a strain like this affected the steering gear, he said. He was not pressed for specific explanations. Perhaps, he suggested, it would be best to run down to the village and make sure everything was safe. He would gladly go with her if she wished. It was quite agreeable to her, if he would be so good, and would he mind driving? Under the circumstances, perhaps that would be better. She asked that the farmer for his charges and paid him more than he asked. He thanked her, awkwardly, feigning reluctance to accept so much. As she entered the car where Bobby sat at the wheel in proprietorial pose, her heart beated rapidly. The farmer, eager to be friendly, said,
That sure is one peach of a car. Looks just like the Packard the Dr. Hudson used to drive around up here.
It is, said the girl quietly. Good night, and thank you again.
Mechanically, Bobby Merrick put the late Dr. Hudson's big coupe in gear, and they were off toward the village.
It seems all right, doesn't it?
Happily remarked the young woman in black who owned the big coupe that Dr. Hudson used to drive around up here. Apparently, her new friend was not yet quite sure enough to reply. His eyes were intent upon the road ahead, and he grasped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Bobby was stirringly conscious of her on the seat beside him, more conscious of her than he had ever been of any woman he had ever known. There was no actual physical contact, but she was most overpoweringly there.
It's all right, he muttered thickly.
I was on my way to the village anyhow, she continued. I do hope the little drugstore will still be open.
Apparently her driver was not posted on the nocturnal habits of the druggist, for he did not venture an opinion. The accelerator received an extra pressure at that moment, and the powerful car suddenly bounded forward.
I can't tell you how grateful I am, said the girl, a little perplexed by his silence. I'm sure I shouldn't have known what to do if you hadn't happened along.
Bobby was occupied with the adjustment of the ignition lever.
But I'm afraid I'm putting you to a great deal of inconvenience, she added anxiously.
He spoke at length, as from a considerable distance. The car is in perfect condition, he said. I'll get out here. You need not go to the garage. The brakes were applied with determination, and the car came to an abrupt stop. Bobby opened the door on the left and stepped out.
Oh, but you're miles from where you found me, she exclaimed. Do let me put you down where you'd rather be, please.
He could not meet her eyes. I was just sauntering, he said absently. It's no matter. She slipped over behind the wheel and held out her hand. It trembled a little as he wrapped his fingers around it. She was bewildered. Whatever had she said to hurt him?
Good night, then, and thank you so much.
Her voice was unsteady. He retained her hand for an instant, said, "Good night," in a tone that might mean weariness, dejection, or disappointment, turned, and stepped away into the darkness. She engaged the gears. The car moved slowly, tentatively, hesitatingly forward. Bobby watched the little red taillight until it vanished at the next turn. A half hour later, he sat down at his piano in the Tomby drawing room at Windermere and, vastly occupied with his reflections, toyed with an experimental ending to Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. Chapter 5. It was late afternoon of the last Sunday in September. Nancy Ashford's snug retreat, immediately adjacent to the general administrative offices in Brightwood Hospital, had proved too small to house the radiant spirits of herself and her guests. She had gratefully accepted Bobby's suggestion that they take a drive. Sitting closely to him in the big, gaudy, rakish roadster, her elbow touching his, it pleased Nancy to indulge the fancy that passers-by might think him her son. Her life had been filled and emptied twice. It was brimming again. Nothing could have been more clear to the white-haired hospital superintendent as she greeted her expected visitor at the door of her little office that afternoon than that he was hopeful of stating his errand in a manner to ensure against its reception with surprise or emotion. He had a very businesslike air, and she determined to match it. He had blurted out his story immediately upon arrival. Tossing his hat upon her desk and seating himself by her on the little divan, he had said brusquely, "Well, I'm resolved to do it. It will be no surprise to you, for it was really your idea in the first place, even if you didn't specify the details. It's all arranged now. I'm entering the medical school at the university a week from Thursday. Are you glad?" Nancy had reached out a hand for his, winked back the sudden tears, and bit her lip in an effort at control. Her eyes shone, but she did not speak. "Of course," continued Bobby hurriedly, as if reciting the lines, "I have no illusions in this matter. It means a long, hard grind of drudgery, and I'm not naturally industrious. It will be 5 years, at least, before I can even guess whether I am likely to succeed, or I've only been making myself ridiculous. I take chances of becoming an obscure second-rater. In that case, I shall have become merely absurd at the cost of a very great deal of time and trouble. People would grin. They would say, I can hear them, 'Yeah, he's the fellow. I thought he'd be another Dr. Hudson.' But maybe the threat of that will put a little more fight in me. It's foolish, I suppose, to hope that I might sometime be even a halfway substitute for him, but I can move in that direction anyway."
"I felt confident you would come to such a decision as this, Bobby," commented Nancy quietly. "And I feel even more sure, now that you have decided, that you will succeed."
"Your hope will help. A lot."
"Now, you were wanting to learn all you can find out about Dr. Hudson, won't you?"
At this juncture, the tiny office had seemed stifling. They would ride. Bobby would drive and listen. Nancy would do the talking. For fully 20 miles, they had been weaving swiftly in and out of the Sunday traffic on crowded boulevards, and now, with speed reduced, were traversing a more quiet suburban street. Nancy had been recalling some of the more singular facts in the life of her hero, especially relating to his wide diversity of philanthropic interests and his odd whim of keeping them a secret. Did his family know?
"I doubt it. Joyce was a mere baby when he began doing these queer things for people, and it is unlikely that he ever told her. And Mrs. Hudson, during a call she made at the hospital only last Thursday, asked me some questions indicating he had not confided that feature of his life to her. Many of his wards and beneficiaries had been coming to see her with expressions of sympathy, and some with proffers of assistance if she needed it. She was naturally curious."
"Yes. I know just a little about that. Learned it only today. Tom Masterson dropped in, and as I was preparing to leave Windermere at noon, he had driven Joyce up to the Hudson cottage, where Mrs. Hudson is spending a few days. He had come over to inquire if I would join them there for the afternoon. I told him of my engagement in town."
"Perhaps you should have gone. You could have telephoned to me. Have you seen Joyce at all?"
"Not since I'm back from France."
"And I presume you never met Mrs. Hudson?"
Bobby wished that question had not been raised. Perhaps it would be near enough the truth to reply in the negative. On second thought, absolute sincerity with Nancy Ashford was but her rightful due. He decided to be honest. "Yes," he answered reluctantly. "I spent a whole hour with her last night on a country road," adding after a considerable pause. "But she doesn't know it."
"Meaning what?"
demanded Nancy, in amazement. Briefly, he narrated the whole circumstance of their meeting. Nancy Ashford's blue eyes widened. Underneath the boyish recital ran a strong current of unmistakable personal interest, which Bobby's attempted tone of casualness failed to conceal.
"I think you liked her, Bobby, didn't you?"
He essayed a smile of indifference. He might even have been able to delude himself into the belief that Nancy accepted the smile as a sufficient answer to her query, had he not been so audacious with his little deceit as to look her full in the face. What he saw there of incredulity and disappointment instantly sobered him. There was no use trying to keep anything from this woman. "My dear," he confessed, with an unsteady voice, "I like her so much I'd rather we didn't talk about it." His big car had idled to a full stop alongside the curb flanking a little park. They were both silent for a while. At length, Nancy said mechanically,
"Well, of all things."
"Yes, agreed Bobby abstractly. Something like that. There was another protracted pause.
And she didn't know who you were?
I couldn't tell her.
How long do you think you can maintain your incognito?
Oh, that should be simple enough, Bobby declared, in a tone of self-deprecation. I took pains to invent an alibi for the evening when I talked to Masterson, in case some inquiries might be made, but Mrs. Hudson has probably forgotten all about the little episode by this time. Nancy laughed.
Bobby Merrick, do you really believe that a young woman of Helen Hudson's temperament could produce the impression she made on you without being fully aware of it? You confessed how acutely conscious you were of her. That was your phrase, wasn't it, as you sat together in her car? Do you think you would have had that sensation had she not shared it?
Of course. Why not? See here, you're taking altogether too much for granted in this case. Mrs. Hudson has no more than courteous, friendly, appreciative of her little favor. She had no reason to think me interested in her. In fact, I was almost rude to her when we parted. He did not feel it necessary to add that her car had crept along in low gear for fully 200 yards, apparently reluctant to leave.
Yes, said Nancy significantly. She would notice that.
And she would know, by my abruptness, wouldn't she?
Know what?
Persisted Nancy ruthlessly. Why, that I was not interested.
Dear boy, how very little you know about her.
Meaning that she has unusual gifts for interpreting other people's private thoughts?
No, foolish. Meaning only that she is a woman.
They strolled under the elms, stopping to watch some small boys sailing toy boats on the little lagoon dappled with lily pads. A bench was found unoccupied. By common consent, their discussion had resumed of Dr. Hudson's queer penchant for concerning himself with the private perplexities of nobody knew how many people, and the thick wall of secrecy with which these strange negotiations were surrounded.
You may as well put it down as a fact, Nancy was saying, with strong conviction, that the curious manner of Wayne Hudson's costly investment in these cases, from which he never expected or accepted any reimbursement, was occasioned by no mere whim. He was not given to whims. He was not an eccentric. I never knew him to do anything without an adequate motive. Nobody could have said that he was reckless with his money or incompetent in business. He could drive a shrewd bargain. He knew when to buy and when to sell. Plenty of businessmen with more commercial experience asked his advice on probable trends in the real estate market and took his judgment about industrial stocks. I am convinced he did these strange things for certain people, in this furtive way, with a definite motive, in some fashion which I don't pretend to understand. His professional success was involved in it. When you find out what that motive was, you'll know why Wayne Hudson was a great surgeon.
Do you know any more about it than you have told me? Regarding her searchingly.
There is a little book, a sort of journal. I think you have a right to know about it. He kept it in the office safe, along with valuable records, some relating to professional matters, some to private business affairs. The book was there when I took over the management of Brightwood. Once, we were looking for some insurance papers. I asked Dr. Hudson whether the little book concerned hospital business.
Couldn't you tell? Interrupted Bobby.
It was not written in English, nor in any other language I ever saw.
What did it look like? Spanish? German? Greek? She shook her head and resumed her story.
I asked him what the little book was. I vividly remember how earnestly thoughtful he grew, and how he stood for many minutes rubbing his temple with the tips of his fingers, a trick of his when trying to arrive at an important decision, saying, after a long wait,
It's just a personal record.
And then he added, smiling,
You are at liberty to read it, if you can.
Did you ever try?
Did I? She echoed. Hours and hours. Lately.
Get anything out of it?
Headache.
I wish I could see it.
I'll show it to you. Nobody has a better right to it. I told Mrs. Hudson there were many valuable documents of the doctors in the hospital safe, and she insisted that we keep them until she was up to looking them over with me. So the book is still there.
Let's go back, he said impetuously. Darkness had fallen before they arrived at Brightwood. Nancy brought the book from the safe and laid it on the desk before him. He sat down and took it in his hands, a plain, black, leather-bound journal, 8 inches by 5, and more than an inch thick. On the flyleaf was written, in Dr. Hudson's quite distinctive hand, the single sentence, "To whom this may concern." Nobody could be any more concerned than I am. He glanced up at Nancy for approval. She nodded.
Now turn over the next page and see what you make of that.
Bobby stared long and hard. It's in code.
You will find it difficult, said Nancy. The way I have figured it is this. Dr. Hudson proposed not to have the matters which he kept secret divulged during his lifetime. The fact that so many of these odd wards of his are bobbing up now, ready to tell their stories of his strange dealings with them, convinces me they were all virtually sworn to secrecy while he lived. Now that he is gone, they tell. I think the mystery is all contained in this book. Whoever reads it knows the real story. Perhaps the doctor was willing it should be known after he was done with it, but made it inaccessible to anyone who might chance upon it while he lived.
He's made it inaccessible enough, I'll say, Bobby growled. Did you ever see the like?
The first page, explained Nancy, is unquestionably a sort of preface. You'll notice that all the other pages are completely filled. This one has only 10 lines. It must be a foreword, an explanation, dedication, perhaps? You take it along with you. Know any Greek?
Bobby shook his head. Oh, I know the alphabet, he qualified, smiling.
That's enough. What's the last letter?
Omega, recited Bobby glibly.
And Omega is sort of a stop signal, isn't it? A sign for the end of something?
He nodded.
How many letters are there in the Greek alphabet?
Bobby closed his eyes and counted on his fingers. 24.
Omega being the 24th and signifying the end.
Right.
Now, what is the 12th letter?
Mu, answered Bobby, after another calculation.
Well, if Omega means finished, what do you suppose Mu means?
Half finished, I suppose. Bobby soberly returned to the preface of the little book and found, at almost regular intervals, the letters Mu and Omega. Is that a clue?
I think so, said Nancy. But it did me no good. I just offer it to you for what it seems to be worth.
Not at any given moment of his long drive home did Bobby Merrick realize exactly where he was, as he swiftly covered his familiar road to Windermere. At midnight he did put up his car, went to his room, sat down before his desk with Dr. Hudson's private journal, a pencil, and a thick pad of paper, and at dawn was still experimenting without a glimmer of encouragement. Meggs, opening the door to call him to breakfast, found him sitting fully dressed, with his head on his arms, asleep, and tiptoed downstairs, his eyes shining. A few minutes later, he whispered to the cook, in a tone of victory, "You lost your bet. Drunk again?"
Quite.
Chapter 6. The glowing lips cast by the heavily shaded lamp at the head of her bed shone upon the weapons with which young Mrs. Hudson had armed herself against drowsiness when, at midnight, she had retired with a novel, 2 magazines, and a leather writing case embarrassingly stuffed with unanswered letters, resolved to stay awake until Joyce returned. Shortly before 2, she had lost the battle and now slept with the light shining into her troubled face. Not that the trifling incident of dropping off could have worried her, but it was all of a piece with the general failure. Had the late Dr. Hudson been subpoenaed to the witness box on the day of his death to report on the success of the marriage he had contracted on behalf of his daughter, he, being unusually fastidious about truth-telling, might have found it an awkward question. The 3 of them had stood up that crisp January morning at St. Andrews in the presence of Uncle Percival and Monty, and the Senator Burns, who had run over from Washington, not so much as bride and groom, attended by a grown daughter, cordially consenting, rather as a pair of strikingly lovely young women, attended by an elderly distinguished guardian, invoking church and state to legalize and bless their comradeship and give them a deed to it. That it was candidly a marriage de convenance, the French for it was more euphonious than the English equivalent, caused Dr. Hudson no serious misgivings. He nursed no illusions on that subject, aware that if all the world's weddings were limited to romantic attachments, in which no material advantages were at issue on either side, the human race would long since have been exterminated. And that if it were unethical for a young woman to marry with the knowledge that she could not immediately give herself with unqualified devotion to her husband, the Holy Virgin herself was at fault. Immediately upon the consummation of his wedding, however, Dr. Hudson had found himself falling sincerely in love with his girl bride, and the comradeship he had sought to ensure between Helen and Joyce was put in jeopardy. Joyce was a poor sailor, and the first 3 days were rough. "No, darling, not a thing. Please run along. I'd much rather you did." So when, on Sunday noon, she had been persuaded to come down to the blanketed chair they had prepared for her on B-deck, she realized that she was being solicitously attended, and on either side, not by an indulgent father and devoted college chum, but by a man and his wife. Good friends of hers, unquestionably, but, well, there you were. All 3 of them tried to twist the contemplated relationship back into focus, but it wouldn't go. Perhaps their very efforts to do so made it impossible. Hudson, in Paris, had enthusiastically encouraged Joyce in her shopping extravagances, and Helen, eager to join in her husband's approval, may have overdone it. "What an exquisite coat! So glad you found it, Joyce. How very becoming!" It was the right attitude, without a doubt, but it hadn't the right inflection. It wasn't as one girl to another, but as an ingratiating stepmother over-anxious to be generous, affectionate. There were no disagreements. Perhaps it might have cleared the air if there had been. Nor was there any constraint on the surface. It was too deep to come to the surface. There was the difficulty. Everything they said to each other was amplified as though a loudspeaker, intensifying their mutual assurances of devotion until it took the tone of unreality. Each knew the other was trying hard to be natural. Each knew the other was playing a difficult part. Almost desperately, they scrambled for the old position, but they had lost the way of it. Shortly after the death of Dr. Hudson, the distance between them increased markedly. For the first few days, they had clung to each other with a rededicated bond that promised to be, if not a restoration of their earlier comradeship, at least an earnest of future indispensability, possibly to become a more valuable relation than any they had heretofore sustained. But it was not for long. Joyce's grief, inconsolable for a week, quickly exhausted itself. It was only common honesty in her when she declared one day that she wasn't going to sit moping any longer, for volatile as she was, any protracted mourning would have been mere affection, even if she were capable of it, which was doubtful. Presently, there came a disquieting furtiveness in her explanation of late hours. Helen's gently tactful queries, implying an uneasiness about her social program, were either dismissed lightly with a chafing reply or met with a brief, albeit friendly, hint that one was quite old enough now to know where one wanted to go and with whom, and until when. She was not to trouble her pretty head about her flighty Joyce. She was to live her own life and stop worrying about trifles.
Don't sit up, darling, Joyce would protest at 9. I'm going out with Ned, or Tom, or Pat, or Phil. We may be late, you know. Where? Oh, I'm not sure. To dance, someplace, I suppose. And a bite of supper, later. Crystal Palace, maybe? Gordon's, perhaps. I don't like your going out to Gordon's, Joyce. Really, that's not a nice place. Tell me you won't, please. Oh, very well. Only one can't do all the deciding. One's escort has something to say about that, too.
On the rose counterpane lay several letters, one of them from Montgomery Brent, briefly, brotherly, suggesting that his counsel would be at his little sister's disposal, should she be troubled about business matters now that her responsibilities were increased. Only too glad, to straighten out the kinks for you when it comes to income tax, investments, and the safeguarding of your estate. That sort of thing is my daily work.
The dear boy, she murmured half aloud as she read it. How decent of him, and not a bit bad idea either. I wonder, does he really know anything about business? He ought to by this time.
Montgomery, who it pleased her to think of as her brother Monty, never more affectionately than now that she felt so desolated, was 5 years her senior. College not agreeing with him after his sophomore year, Monty had brought his saxophone to the jazz market. Not quite satisfied to make a permanent profession of bouncing and writhing and puffing himself purple every night from 8 until 2 in the front row of a dance orchestra, he had made some friends among the chalky-fingered youngsters who posted the board at a downtown brokerage office. In a few months, he had a desk and a small salaried position in the organization. "I'm a broker," he would reply maturely, when some young thing coyly inquired, while they danced, what college she attended. Doubtless he was doing well enough now. He had not borrowed from Helen for more than a year, had given her an expensive silver vase for a wedding present, appearing on that occasion in a morning coat, striped trousers, and spats, the only man present who had given no quarter to the request for informal dress. It wasn't a half-bad idea. There was one friend left, anyhow, good old Monty. Another letter was a brief note written to Joyce by the young Merrick person, dated from Ann Arbor, evidently composed with much care. It left many things unsaid, which its author assumed would be read into it. He had entered the medical school, hopeful of becoming of some use eventually to the profession which her father had so conspicuously adorned.
I never would have picked him for the part,
Joyce had interpolated as she read that much of the letter to Helen.
Rather quixotic, don't you think?
Did it on impulse, likely,
Helen had remarked.
Rather fine of him, though, with that, wouldn't you say?
Championed Joyce.
I'll tell you a year from now.
Helen had replied half-audibly. Joyce had continued reading to herself. With a gesture of impatience, upon finishing the letter, she tossed it across the table and savagely dug into her grapefruit.
I think you had better answer it, Helen. The only human, personal line in it is for you. Write and tell him that you hope he gets on well with his teachers and makes A's in everything.
she snapped with frank asperity. The only human personal line read, "Please convey my sympathy and regards to Mrs. Hudson, whom I hope I may soon have the chance to know." Helen had made no further comment. Her opinion of the young Merrick person was based solely upon Joyce's disquieting references to him, a spoiled youngster with loose habits and too much money. It was clear enough that the girl entertained an infatuation for him which he had made no effort to capitalize. Helen was glad of it. She had no wish to meet him, had dreaded the day when he might turn up. It was enough that he had been the cause of her husband's tragedy. Not his fault, of course. But she hoped he would not make it necessary for her to try to be nice to him. It was a closed incident. She was relieved. The letter had remained in her pile of morning mail beside her plate. Later, it had been tucked into her portfolio. She had read it again in bed. Well, it was no concern of hers, whether he made good or not. At least, he was out of Joyce's calculations. One questionable friend less to worry about. Helen was awakened with a start, as the door of her room was cautiously opened far enough to admit the flushed face of Joyce.
"You, Joyce?"
The door was closing, slowly, cautiously.
"Sorry, darling. Good night,"
came in muffled tones from beyond the door.
"Come in, dear,"
called Helen. There was considerable delay before the door opened again. Joyce came in jerkily, all but asleep on her feet, dazedly rubbing her forehead with the back of her hand in which she clutched her crumpled hat, the other groping uncertainly for something to support her. She leaned heavily against the foot of the bed, swaying dizzily.
"Oh, but my dear,"
cried Helen, in consternation, propping herself up suddenly on her elbows.
"What in the world? Where have you been?"
"Gordon's." Joyce ground out the guttural tension between tensely locked jaws and smiled fatuously. Helen sat up, peered incredulously, silently at her disheveled stepdaughter, who grew restive under the inspection. You been writing letters?" Joyce surveyed the litter on the bed with a pitiable attempt at casualness. Helen nodded briefly and pressed both hands tightly against her forehead in a gesture of despair, which Joyce decided to ignore.
"And if there isn't Dickie Bobby?"
She leaned far over the foot of the bed and with an elaborate precision flicked the letter contemptuously with her finger.
"That? For you, Dr. Merrick?" "Why, Joyce Hudson, you're drunk."
Helen stepped out into her slippers, caught up a kimono, and put her arm about the girl's sagging shoulders.
"Who? Me?" giggled Joyce amiably. "Me? Drunk? You should see Tommy."
"Let me help you to bed," pleaded Helen brokenly. "No, here. You may sleep in my room." Joyce fumbled helplessly at her buttons with one hand, the other clumsily mopping her dripping brow with her little hat. Presently she crumpled on the bed, and Helen tugged off her dress and laid a cold towel across her eyes.
"Thanks, darling," mumbled Joyce between heavy sighs. "Much bother. Too bad. All my fault. Don't blame Tommy. Tommy nice boy. Gonna marry Tommy. Well, can't you I'm afraid I can't say it very distinctly, but aren't you glad about Tommy and me?"
"Let's wait and talk it over in the morning, dear," soothed Helen, turning the towel and patting it about the flushed temples.
"No, sir," babbled Joyce with an expansive gesture. "We're gonna talk about."
She brought a slim, lovely hand down with a clumsy slap on the pillow.
"Right now."
The towel was brushed aside, and she gazed up militantly with swollen eyes.
That's just like you. You cry. I come home all happy to announce my engagement to Tommy, and you cry. What's the big idea? Do you want him?
Bridling her impatience, Helen urged the drunken girl to leave off and go to sleep. Maudlin tears of self-pity bathed Joyce's face.
Nobody loves me, she wailed. Nobody but good old Tommy. But I won't marry him. I won't.
Presently she relaxed, licked her stiff lips, sighed deeply, and slept. Helen knelt by the bed, her face buried in the covers to escape the heavy fumes, and wept piteously. Wayne Hudson had left her with a responsibility quite too serious to be met. Only one thing had he expected of her, and she had failed him. At length, rousing stiffly from the cramped position in which she had fallen asleep through sheer fatigue and nervous exhaustion, she mechanically collected the scattered letters from the floor, turned out the light, and went dejectedly to Joyce's bedroom. She put down the letters on the little vanity table and bathed her face with cologne. Bobby Merrick's rather stilted note lay open before her as if inviting attention. Between the lines, it announced that he had considered himself under a moral obligation to Dr. Hudson. She had been disposed to wave that implication aside as a mere pose, a bit of ephemeral martyrdom to be toyed with until he tired of it, a pretense of gallantry. She averted her eyes from the letter, perplexed, accused by it. Was she, too, under a certain moral obligation to Dr. Hudson? Young Merrick was trying to discharge his. How about hers? She carefully folded the letter and stood for a long time, preoccupiedly deepening its creases with nervous fingers. It occurred to her that she would like to have a long, confidential talk with Bobby Merrick. Perhaps he might have something to suggest. She stared at her haggard reflection in the mirror and shook her head. No, the way out did not lie in that direction. She tucked the letter into her writing case and tumbled wearily into bed. Chapter 7. At 1 o'clock on the morning of Thanksgiving Day, young Merrick solved the riddle to which he had devoted much of his spare time for nearly 2 months. After only a week's sporadic work on it, he had written to Nancy Ashford. When the light breaks on this, it will not come like a valley dawn. The book is going to be pitch dark up to a certain moment, and after that it will be clear and bright as a June morning. There's no halfway business about a job like this. Either you can read it all with ease and understanding, or you can't read a syllable. The Thanksgiving recess had begun at noon on Wednesday. Bobby determined to spend the brief vacation on the cryptic journal. It would be a good time. Distractions and interruptions would be reduced to a minimum, for no sooner had the noon whistles blown than the student quarter was as deserted as if warned of an impending epidemic of the Black Plague. He had made a tentative promise to have evening dinner on Thanksgiving Day with old Nicholas, provided I finish a problem it is important to complete at once. All Wednesday afternoon, he turned from one futile experiment to another, most of them being variants of schemes already tried. It annoyed him that he seemed unable to bring his attention to a sharp focus. Now he would sit at his desk for an hour, sharpening pencils and gazing glassily at the mocking script. Now he would fling himself across his bed and, supporting himself on his aching elbow, set down columns of letters in every manner of eccentric sequence. Oblivious of the passing time, his own discomfort, his need of exercise, his continued to lay out diagrams and tear up paper. Night came down, and he turned on the lights. Midnight found him very weary, his brain operating mechanically, sluggishly. He tapped his teeth with his pencil and went wool-gathering in spite of himself. He even made a brief mental excursion on foot along the highway to the north of Windermere and assisted a motorist in distress. Recovering himself impatiently, he pursued his endless diagrams. Then a fresh idea occurred to him. Here was something he had not yet tried. He wrote the first few words of the unintelligible script in a running line, utterly disregarding the spaces between them. It had long been his practice to reproduce the letter in capitals, thinking this might help to simplify the words. Now he broke in two what was obviously the first sentence, at the point where the Greek letter mu indicated a half stop, and set down the remainder of that obvious division immediately below it. Moved by RAEIOSDROMFIN over EDRCNIEYUYRED. Moved by sheer caprice, he wrote the lines again, the second division lacking one space of meeting the margin. RAEIOSDROMFIN over EDRCNIEYUYRED. For full 5 minutes he stared at this combination until the lines blurred and blended. Of a sudden, his heart speeded up. His pencil shook as he rapidly rewrote the letters, mortizing the lines. Reader, I consider you my friend. I have it! He shouted aloud, laughed ecstatically, half hysterically. How ridiculously simple it was now that he had cracked it open. Within 5 minutes of feverish copying and mortizing, he had decoded the brief message of the first page. Reader, I consider you my friend and commend your perseverance. Having achieved the ability to read this book, you have also the right to possess it. My reasons for doing this in cipher will be made plain as you proceed. With the long strain relaxed, Bobby awoke to the fact that he was wolfishly hungry. He dressed for the street, a broad grin of self-satisfaction on his face. It was good to have conquered something. As he stood before the glass knotting his scarf, he glanced at the little black book on the table as a gladiator might have regarded a recumbent antagonist. Stepping out into the stinging sleet storm, invigorated by its tonic thrust, he squared his shoulders, lengthened his stride, took deep inhalations, laughed joyously, sang the Marseillaise, and marched to it, swinging his long arms with a triumphant swagger. There was a little chop house only a block south of the mythic Michigan Central Station where one Tony held forth all night. Tony was typical of the occasional small shopkeeper, erudite barber, philosophical cobbler, or picturesque restaurateur to be found in every college town, by whose eccentricities, combined with a sincere interest in varsity athletics and the institution at large, they contrived to achieve local fame. Many a full professor at the state university would have been happy and lucky had he been able to call as many undergraduates by their names as Tony. The turnover in population in a college town being bewilderingly rapid, Tony's 11 years' residence in Ann Arbor had made him a fixture, an institution. It was as if he had been there since the 6th day of creation. He was reputed to be quite well-to-do, in spite of the fact that he extended credit and made unsecured loans to students with a naive faith that would have closed a bank in 48 hours. On the cigar case lay open a cheap daybook. Attached to it, by a cotton string, was a pencil. If a student came into Tony's place without funds, he ordered what he liked, and upon leaving, wrote his name and the amount of his indebtedness in the book. It was not necessary to establish one's credit. One wrote in the book. When one got around to it, one paid off the score, leafed back through the book, located, and personally deleted the item. Tony unemotionally accepted the payment. His failure to smile his thanks over the liquidation of the debt was in itself a pretty compliment. Having known it would be paid, there was no occasion for breaking out into rapture. Tony himself came on duty at 6 in the evening and stayed the night. Nobody ever saw him at his place of business in the daytime, capable assistants being in charge through the breakfast and lunch hours. "Tony, how come you only work at night?" he was frequently asked by his clients as he plunked platters of ham and eggs on a bare wooden table. "You rather I not be here at night, eh?" Tony would inquire, grinning, quite aware that in the noisy protest which this rejoinders would evoke, their original inquiry would be forgotten. Periodically, young reporters on the Michigan Daily, hopeful of developing what they suspected was an unusual flair for feature writing, would engage Tony in conversation about his business. How much did he lose annually through bad loans and loose credit? Why did he only work at night when business was unimportant? And sundry queries phased in the best conventional manner of journalistic impertinence. But no story had ever appeared on this subject, Tony invariably taking refuge, when hard-pressed, behind his inadequate knowledge of English. "I couldn't get anything out of him. He's too damn dumb." "Yeah," the sophisticated Sunday editor would reply. "My boy, you have made the customary blunder of mistaking Tony's depth for thickness." Bobby Merrick knew from experience that Tony would be on hand tonight to attend to his pressing wants. He would be served with amazing rapidity a steak well able to hold its own alongside many a more snobbish cut of select beef with a Parisian name, all buttoned up with back with mushrooms and presented with stiff salams on a silver-mounted plank at a cost 10 times the tariff Tony levied. There would be freshly made coffee and a salad worthy of an exacting palate. Tony knew exactly when to stop rubbing the bowl with garlic. Bursting into the little cafe, Bobby found himself in the sole patron. Tony, drowsy but amiable, made haste to draw out of a chair for him. With the grace of a courtier, he took his guest's heavy fur coat and deftly shook the snow from its shoulders. His client enumerated his desires with the eloquent conviction of one who knows exactly what he wants, and Tony made off with his instructions. "Needn't bother about the potatoes, Tony," called Bobby as his host began to rattle his pans. "Out damn late, Doc," shouted Tony, above the hiss of the hot grill. He had an unerring instinct for identifying medics, probably because they were older than the rah-rahs and had a pungent smell. Medics were always highly aromatic of their future trade. "Baby case, maybe?" He liked to make the young medics think they looked old and wise enough to be interns at least, or out on call, understrapping for their snug-in-bed betters. Eventually, the more industrious and persistent would be doctored officially, some fine June morning at Hill Auditorium in the sonorous tones of the president, but every one of them had long since received his degree from Tony. They chaffed one another about it, but never chided him, or suggested that he discontinue the practice. "No, Tony," drawled Bobby, "nothing like that. Not for a long time yet. And no babies, ever." Tony plopped the thick stone dishes down with a comforting clatter on the bare table, adorned only by deep carved initials, some of them to be pointed to with pride, many of them reminiscent of excellent stories, without which the university traditions would have been seriously impoverished. The steak was a masterpiece. The potatoes had arrived, magnanimously unmindful of the guests' feeling of indifference toward them. There was a head of chilled lettuce, half the size of a small cabbage, dripping with the creamy Roquefort dressing, not to be had in the exact degree of all rightness in more than 6 other places in the North Temperate Zone. "Coffee, Doc." "You bet, Tony. Strong as brandy and hot as hell. I'm in great need of nourishment." Tony put down the steaming mug. thrust his big thumbs under his apron string in the vicinity of his waistcoat pockets, and considered his voracious customer with deep satisfaction. The next best thing to broiling a choice steak was watching a healthy client make proper use of it. No babies, eh? Bobby shrugged a shoulder and shook his head. I year nose, maybe? Lot of dim fellers. Heads, declared Bobby, stoutly abjuring ophthalmology, otology, and all their works. Ah, so, Tony grew excited. I show you a head. You'll like for to see heads. Look, Doc. He bent down and offered for a minute inspection a 4-inch strip of bare white scalp. Straightening, he lightly tapped the cigar and nodded several times very solemnly. I damn near died. Very bad. Accident? Inquired Bobby. Railroad. Wreck, maybe? Tony chuckled. Nah, work on the railroad. Just, what you call, whop. Not ride. So after you were hurt, you thought you had enough of working on the railroad, eh? I'll save the world, concurred Tony, whose amazing use of the prevailing slang was by no means the least of his conversational charms. Doc Hudson, he sent me up here. You don't tell me. Bobby put down his fork and gave attention. Tony nodded vigorously. Doc Hudson, Detroit, he fixed me, patched the head, put me into business. Great feller. Too bad he died. When it was evident that his patron wanted to know all about it, Tony was eager to furnish information. The sanguinary account of his accident was recited dramatically, with much stress upon the grisly details, not omitting a quite voluminous report of the minor incidents leading up to the event, many of which were less essential to the pathology of the case than to the histrionic technique of the narrator. All but dead he had been, yes. The company surgeon had called in Dr. Hudson. Hudson had done the impossible. But never again must Tony be working under the hot sun. Never. But what can I do? I cry. I starve, maybe. Can you cook, Tony, he say. It developed into a long story. Dr. Hudson had spent a whole day helping Tony locate a suitable place for his little restaurant, had guaranteed the rent of the building, had been present at the purchase of the range, had deposited to Tony's account in the leading bank a sum sufficient to carry him until his income was assured. I'd never heard about this before, Tony, said Bobby. Nah, nobody knew. Doc say, Tony, tell nobody. Not while I leave. He dead now, I can tell. Bobby's glassy look of abstraction was mistaken for waning interest in the story, and Tony had no wish to bore his guest. He would return to the medic's pet interest. It was reasonably sure he would be attentive to an inquiry about his own aspirations. So, you do his too, maybe, like Doc Hudson. I hope to, Tony. Someday, said Bobby, rising. Great feller, Doc Hudson. Nobody knew. Young Merrick paid his bill, donned his coat, said good night, lingered with his hand on the latch. Tony had begun clearing the table. I say, Tony. Tony put down a double handful of dishes. Did Dr. Hudson ever tell you why he wanted you to keep it a secret about his setting you up here? Tony inserted his thumbs under his apron string and strolled forward, meditatively shaking his head. Damn funny feller. He say, like I tell you, Tony, I fix you so no more work in the hot sun. When I leave, you tell nobody. I say, Doc, you one damn fine feller. I pay you back someday. He say, nah, but Tony, he say, some damn cold night, if a feller come in hungry and broke. Yeah? Prodded Bobby, for Tony had apparently changed his mind about the advisability of this confidence and had dismissed the rest of the sentence with a gesture. His red face crinkled with perplexity, and he rubbed the side of his bulbous nose with the corner of his apron. Nodding, jerkily, after the manner of an old man, he turned away and was resuming his interest in the dishes. What then? Pursued Bobby, at his elbow.
Doc say that never tell nobody while I leave.
You mean you never tell about these fellows who come in here hungry and broke? Listen, I'll bet you a new fur-lined overcoat against a package of fags that little account book over there on the case. And all these fellows who come in here hungry and broke. Tony interrupted. His face was very serious. He picked up his tray, and as he straightened dignifiedly, he replied in a thickening dialect significant that he was about to submerge and become incommunicable.
Is it that you will make old Tony unhappy? I'll read the book. It is for me to know. That cousin, he said, Tony, you tell nobody. For why he say that, I do not know. But I tell nobody.
I'm sorry, Tony, said Bobby contritely. I had no right to intrude in your personal affairs. I beg your pardon. Tony smiled absently.
Oh, it is all right.
He said reassuringly.
Good night, Doc. Come again.
Chapter 8. Haggard from a sleepless night and the experience of more mental agony than he had suspected himself capable of, young Merrick sank dejectedly into a club chair on an early train for Detroit. In response to the long and excited telegram he had sent her from the railroad station while en route to Tony's the night before, he hardly wished for 2 hours afterward he had not sent it. Nancy Ashford had wired she would be waiting for him at the Michigan Central Depot. It was the picture of her, radiant with anticipation and bubbling with questions that he dreaded most. Nancy must not be hurt. As for himself, he would get over it. Somehow he would be able to accommodate himself to the utter abandonment of his cherished illusions about Dr. Hudson and the hero worship that had held him up in his dull, monotonous grind at the medical school. Though, now that the bottom had fallen out of everything, he wondered how he could go back and tread the mill again. But, however difficult that might be, it was simple enough compared to the pending job of sitting down beside Nancy Ashford and hunting for pleasant words with which to tell her that her sainted Wayne Hudson, to whom she had unrequitably given her full devotion, was crazy. He was not even an interesting lunatic. A lunatic, often as not, was a brilliant mind that had blown up under compression, blown up splendidly with a loud report, the neighbors hurrying with straps and stretchers to collect the debris and lug it off to the madhouse. No, this man Hudson had not been good enough to himself to explode so that everybody could hear it and know what the Big Bang meant. He was just a plain nut. Can you feature it? Grown-up man, of good standing professionally, respected and admired, toiling interminably over the detailed report a somewhat wild-eyed crank had told him of impossible experiences, and then going to an enormous bother of concealing that hodgepodge of delusions in a code, a performance worthy the mind of a seventh-grade schoolboy playing sleuth with a toy pistol. Returned from Tony's, wide awake and exultant, he had resolved, late as it was, to decode a few pages of the journal. He had read patiently at first, with a broad smile of anticipation. Presently, he found himself wishing the eccentric author would soon have done with his commonplace preliminaries and settled to business in the disclosure of his big secret. For it would have to be a big one to justify all this elaborate hocus-pocus of the code. Surely nothing was discoverable so far as he had gone that required any thick wall of secrecy. It might be difficult to induce the general public to read it, were it printed in English for free circulation, but to pretend it was a deep mystery was idiotic. After a while he had come upon a paragraph that drew from the corners of his mouth and dragged bitter "what tell" from an over-smoked throat. He pushed the little book aside contemptuously, rose, paced the floor, lighted his pipe, tossed it clatteringly upon the table, undressed, and went to bed, but not to sleep. His disappointment was the most serious jolt of his life. Never, until 3 months ago, had he ever taken any stock in big moments, crucial decisions, great renunciations, consecrations, and the like. If people suddenly left off doing one thing and went galloping away in another direction, it was because they had sighted something more to their advantage. As for the legends of Saul and St. Francis and Joan, well, if there was any substratum of truth in them, the psychiatrics could explain it. Nor had he ever any patience with that sticky confectionery of sentimentalism, that daintily perfumed moonshine, which effeminate visionaries referred to as ideals. He had always been willing that all such blather should be left to the exploitation of preachers, poets, and the sob sisters. Lately he had changed his mind about that. The coincidence of his having been saved from the lake at the same hour a valuable life had been lost in it, and at the price of that life had stampeded him into a grand orgy of sentiment. He could understand Saul and Joan. Hudson had become his ideal, his star, his sun, his totem pole. Now it was all over. There had been an old story about an idol that had fallen down because it had clay feet. He had tumbled over with vertigo, sick in the head. To have grown to manhood without an ideal of any kind, to have espoused one belatedly with a crusading zeal, to have discovered, after burning all his bridges behind him, that his hero was a sap. It was a nasty wallop. He had gouged his hot face into his pillow and decanted his wrath to its bitter lees. It wasn't that he had any fault to find with Hudson's penchant for poking a prehensile snout into other people's affairs with a passionate urge to do his one good deed per day, like the Boy Scout his silly little journal proclaimed him. But, my God, Hudson wasn't the first man in all human history who had titillated his ego and busted the buttons off his waistcoat by doing alms. What a pother about nothing! At long last he had drifted off into an uneasy sleep, growling that he had a damned good notion to go to New York in the morning and hop the first boat for Cherbourg. His passport was still alive. Grand Pierre would gladly send it to him. Then he would have to stop and face Nancy. What a rotten trick that would be. And Grand Pierre? The dear old boy had taken a lot of pride in him lately. He would be in Detroit now in 5 minutes. He must be careful not to offend Nancy. Why not hand her the journal and the code key and make off hurriedly to keep some urgent engagement? He could say his grandfather needed him badly. It would be true enough if he said he himself was sick. She was waiting for him at the gates, wide-eyed and smiling, when he first sighted her from the tunnel. A bit perplexed as he drew nearer, so it was plastered all over his mug then. He tried to pull a smile, a sickly smirk he knew it was, slipped an arm through hers, inquired, without meeting her eyes, if she'd had anything to eat, which she hadn't, told the porter to check his bags, and propelled Nancy to a quiet corner of the station restaurant where he made much ado about helping her with a coat, nervous as a caged fox.
"But I thought you had succeeded, dear."
She followed him with inquiring eyes as he multiplied his little attentions and made no end of troubling for himself, trying to find a place for her umbrella.
"You don't resemble a conquering hero. You look more like the man who had set out after a beautiful butterfly, under the impression it was some kind of bird, and found, after battering its wings to bits, that he had captured a worm."
Bobby put down the menu, which he had begun to pore over assiduously, and emphasized his rejoinder by planting a long index finger close to her plate. "Now you've said it. I went after a butterfly and came back with a worm."
"And whose fault was that? The butterflies?"
"Take your base, Nancy," he conceded with a chuckle.
"Take my base, indeed. What about your wild pitching? I tell you it was a safe hit and a home run. But no matter about the butterfly. Wake up, stupid, and let me into the secret."
At that he attempted to rally, cleared his throat, made pretense of rolling up his sleeves. He wasn't going to let Nancy down. Maybe he himself could carry on without the guidance of Hudson Spectre, but Nancy couldn't. He would save the honor of her precious goat if he had to profess faith in voodooism, necromancy, and witchcraft. I'm tired, that's all. Up nearly all night. Let's talk to the waiter first. She was not reassured, but willing to be patient. It's simple as addition, he declared, when the waiter had trotted off. That is, pleating the tablecloth with restless fingers. The mere mechanics of converting the script into readable sentences is easy enough, but to understand what it's about, once you've done that... He broke off suddenly and smiled. By the Lord Harry, he'd been handed his cue at last. Now he could make his speech. He'd tell her all the stuff was too deep for him, that he would be infinitely better than to say it was childish piffle.
Why, how very exciting, exclaimed Nancy. Out of one mystery into another.
Bobby took the book from his pocket and opened it on the table before her, their heads close together. He was smiling now, quite pleased with his decision to let her explain it to him. Look, I'll read you the first page. Easy enough, isn't it? Nancy was ecstatic. She spread her hand over Bobby's and gripped it hard. Almost too good to be true, wasn't it? He nodded, adding mentally, or even entertaining.
How far have you gone?
She inquired, leafing the unintelligible pages.
Aren't you just thrilled to death?
Bobby had no enthusiasm to match hers, try as he would. Over to here, about 20 pages. Thrilled? Well, no. Not that exactly. Just stupefied. It's over my head, you see. Suppose I'm like your clumsy naturalist chasing a butterfly. I've been expecting so deuced much. And having worked so long to pry the lid off this thing that now it's off. Maybe I've damaged it somehow. Or perhaps I haven't the mentality to... Nancy clutched his hand again, savagely.
Look me straight into the eyes, Bobby. Bobby Merrick. You've not been yourself for one instant since you arrived. You can't put anything over me. I've been all through you with a lantern. You're trying to keep something back. I won't have it. Come clean now and tell me all about it. What's the trouble, boy?
Bobby flushed and hung his head like a naughty child caught in the jam pot. Ah, the stuff's no good. Bunk, if you ask me. If anybody else but Dr. Hudson had... I say, Nancy, are you quite sure he really did write this? It isn't signed, you know.
Don't talk nonsense. What's it about?
Well, it isn't exactly religion, I guess, but it reads like those goofy tracts that shabby chaps with dirty whiskers toss into the open window of your car. Slush you can have by the ton for a whole lot less than the asking. And why he should have gone to the pains of jiggling the words all out of shape, as if they spelled some precious secret, the good God only knows. If anybody else had written it, I'd say he was all unhooked. Nancy had been tapping the table with her fingertips thoughtfully, impatiently, indignantly, and now explosively.
How old are you, Bobby? She snapped.
25 going on 26, he recited, in the tone of 6 going on 7, a pleasantry she failed to acknowledge.
Well, when Dr. Hudson was just coming into national renown for having reformed the first head operation of its kind in the history of surgery, you still had some of your milk teeth to cut and were galloping about the nursery on a stick horse. When he wrote this bunk, you hadn't learned to wash your own ears. I don't mean to be rough with you, Sonny, but you need a drubbing, and you're jolly well going to get it from Nancy Ashford this day.
Go ahead. I'd rather you were sore at me than...
Hadn't a nerve enough to finish it, had you? You were trying to say you hoped I wouldn't believe that Dr. Hudson was a fool. Don't give yourself any concern about that. I won't. I presume you've never had your attention called, she went on, biting her words into bits, to the psychology of the genius. Why should you, indeed? Freshman medics aren't troubled much, I presume, with excursions into the rarer altitudes of psychiatry which deal with obsessions. They're kept too busy peeling the pelts off cadavers, trying to remember which is incus and which is stapes, trying to distinguish carpal from tarsus. Oh, I know. You needn't hoity-toity me with your wisdom.
She suddenly sighted the open-mouthed waiter.
Here, if you're looking for something to amuse me, take this cold coffee away and bring a fresh pot. Some that was made this morning, preferably.
Bobby burst out with a peal of laughter as the fellow paddled away. Nancy, you're a scream. Do go on.
I mean to. I'm going to give you your first information about the genius type. The genius won't pigeonhole. He won't card index. He won't file. And because he won't, the dull-eyed dolts who hadn't need any trimming to fit whatever pack they properly belong to think him crazy. They can't understand him, so he's unhooked. He romps away where they can't follow, so he's gone wild. He bestrides an idea and rides it furiously across country, over ditches and fences, through people's houses, trampling down fields and gardens, knocking even his best friends down and never knowing it, never looking back, or caring a tinker's damn, so long as he can retain his seat on that one tremendous idea. Now our Dr. Hudson was that sort of a person, and he became obsessed with an idea. He conceived a notion. I'm sure I don't know how he came by it. Maybe this book tells. I have hoped it would. That his professional success depended upon certain eccentric philanthropies, which had to be kept secret to be effective. That much I managed to guess long ago. Then the thought occurred to him, apparently, that he would put his theory into such shape that his heirs or successors or admirers might have a go at it. But he wanted to be insured against the ridicule of some pinhead who, pouncing upon it by accident—
Bobby raised a hand. You're getting rather excited, aren't you?
You find it ridiculous that he employed this silly cipher, she continued,
lowering her voice.
Well, suppose he'd written it in Latin, which he easily could have done without a lexicon. Would that have caused you any less bother? Or Greek? He could have done it in Greek. How much Greek do you know beyond the letters of your fraternity badge? He wanted to make somebody dig for it, I tell you. And that was all of a piece with his obsession. It was part of it.
You win, Nancy, admitted Bobby quietly. You and I think the same thing about Dr. Hudson. We just say it differently, that is all. I say he must be mentally unhooked, and you say he was a genius and that all geniuses are unhooked. Very good. Now we can read the little book together and understand each other, even if we can't understand the book. I'll give you a brief digest of what I've read so far, Nancy. It isn't that I begrudge him the time I've spent untangling this involved cipher. It's only that there's really nothing in it that calls for such mysterious handling. You'll see.
I won't be sure about that until we've read the book, all through.
Bobby fingered his notes. Story begins about a year after the death of Joyce, his first wife. Her long illness and slowed him up, absorbed all the neural energy that should have gone into his professional training. On the edge of failure and in deep depression, he was half-minded to give up surgery and go into business. It occurred to him one day that Joyce's grave should be marked.
Ah, there you are,
ejaculated Nancy with suppressed excitement. Bobby glanced up inquiringly.
The tombstone was a milestone,
she explained with emotion.
How often, when he wanted to date some event in his experience, it would be shortly after I had erected the little marker for Joyce. Do go on.
He went to a concern dealing in memorial stones and selected an inexpensive monument. On the blank form, he wrote his wife's name and the vital dates. Manager asked if he wished a brief epitaph. It seems to have been customary at the time. Unable on the spur of the moment to think of an appropriate sentiment, and eager to close the business at once, he was advised to stroll out into the production department and look about. Perhaps he might see something there that appealed to him. So, he went through the factory where monuments were under construction, and there he accidentally came upon this man, Randolph.
You speak of this man Randolph as if he figured somewhat in the tale? I never heard of him.
Yeah, Randolph is by way of being the hero of the piece as far as I have gone. I leave it to you to say, after you've made his acquaintance, whether Randolph is an apostle of light or as mad as the Hatter. Personally, I haven't any use for him. He makes his debut in the story as an exceptionally gifted hypnotist. Turns out to be some sort of miracle man.
Are you trying to tell me, demanded Nancy, that Wayne Hudson took an interest in a person of that sort?
Well, you shall see. This Randolph fellow was in the studio partitioned off from the main production room. He was not a mere stonecutter, but a sculptor. An uncommonly good one, artist type. This piece he was doing, according to the journal, was a triumphant, angelic figure, heroic size, gracefully poised on a marble pedestal, altar-shaped. An exquisitely modeled hand shading the eyes which gazed towards the far horizon, entranced by some distant radiance. It all had the combined delicacy and strength of a kind of a...
Are you quoting?
Yes, it's in the book, just that way.
But Dr. Hudson knew practically nothing about art.
He may have known more about it than you thought. He was heavily influenced by this crazy Randolph, as you see, and Randolph was a consummate artist.
Oh, I wonder. Do you suppose it could have been Clive Randolph? You know, the sculptor who did that group of children in the Metropolitan. He's been dead for years. Why, Bobby, I do believe he used to live here in Detroit.
Likely as not. He put his penciled notes down on the table and sat for a time with half-closed eyes absorbed. Another genius, he mumbled. Nancy, geniuses do have a right to be batty, don't they?
Certainly.
Nancy glowed. Bobby was seeing the light. He took up his memorandum. Well, on the face of this altar-shaped pedestal was engraved in high relief, in ecclesiastical letters, these words: Thanks be to God who give us the victory. Nancy murmured that she thought it odd. How do you mean odd? It's in the Bible somewhere, isn't it?
Doubtless,
she conceded with a nervous laugh.
It could be in the Bible almost anywhere, and still be odd, couldn't it? But what I mean is that it seems queer to find Dr. Hudson reciting a quotation from a Bible. He wasn't the tiniest mite religious.
Don't you be too sure about that, he warned.
Why, Bobby, he was not only unconcerned, he was almost contemptuous of religious organizations. Hadn't been inside a church except at weddings for 20 years. He was soured on churches as a small boy, told me once. It was when some quite dreadful evangelist was here and the papers were full of the cheap vulgarities, that the churches in his village were forever haranguing people to come apart from the world, when they had nothing to offer in exchange for such renunciation but the vestigial remains of medieval superstitions.
But couldn't he have been interested in the supernatural without being a church adherent?
Well, would he? It isn't customary.
Oh, well, if you propose to analyze this thing in the light of what's customary, let's go to the football game and quit torturing ourselves. I ask you, is it customary for a man to conduct his ordinary charities by stealth, scampering, squirrel fashion, into his hole and pulling the hole in after him at the approach of anyone who might discover he had done somebody a good turn? Is it customary for a man to write the story of his madness in a kiddish cipher? I'll tell you what it was. One of these old-time mystics. Believed in fairies, had visions, played with the angels.
Bobby Merrick, you're C-R-A-Z-Y.
No, not yet. But I've a queer feeling I'm gonna be. Nancy pushed back her plate and impatiently waved the waiter away when he asked if everything wasn't all right. No. Bobby slowly shook his head judiciously. It wasn't really religion that he had. Not what I think of as religion, anyway. I don't pretend to know much about it. But isn't religion just a more or less perfunctory acceptance of a lot of old myths abstracted from the folklore of the Jews? It tries to make people say they believe this and that about God. Imagines it knows what God wants humanity to do. Something waiting sadly for mankind to do it, and at other times pushing people about so that they've got to do it willy-nilly, takes up subscriptions to send barkers to the so-called heathen, warning them they'll seethe in hell if they don't leave off calling their god whatever it is and call him something else. Nancy laughed.
It isn't that bad, Bobby. It couldn't possibly be that silly. People do get a lot of comfort out of their religion, or they wouldn't stick to it.
Comfort, he echoed. I'm glad you used that word. I believe I can tell you now that I think was the difference between this stuff that Dr. Hudson had and the conventional sort of religion. Ordinary religion is intended to bring comfort. Believe such and such. Have comfort, peace, assurance that all is well and a great somebody's looking after things. Well, this religion that Hudson had certainly brought him no comfort. Rode him like the old man of the sea, lashed him on, hounded him by day and haunted him by night, worked him like a slave, obsessed him.
He could have given it up, couldn't he, if it annoyed him?
Ah, there you are. Now you touched the vital spot. No, he couldn't give it up because it furnished his motive power. It was what kept it going. Says it made him professionally.
I'm afraid you've let this book get horribly on your nerves, Bobby.
Nancy drew on her gloves.
Let us go out to Brightwood, where we'll not be interrupted, and see what it's all about.
Bobby was slow to rise. Nancy, my whole attitude towards this matter is changing since talking it over with you. I don't mind telling you, I was never so disgusted or disappointed in my life as last night when I tried to read this stuff. But that was because I expected it to be a normal account of a normal man's experiences, and when I found it wasn't normal, well, I committed the usual blunder of pronouncing it silly. Nancy was radiant.
Exactly. So long as he was saying the customary thing, the normal thing, the thing you understood he was saying. And when he got to the unusual, the thing that you did not understand, he was crazy. That's the way the average mind operates, but you daren't make snap judgment like that, for you're to be dealing with queer heads all your life.
Throughout the long taxi drive to the hospital, their conversation studiously avoided the mystery they had confronted. They talked of his medical course. What did he like best? She shuddered when he spoke of his delight in anatomy. One gets used to that, he assured her. And old Huber's a prince. He handles those poor cadavers as if they were our relatives. I'll bet if some of them had been given as much tender consideration while alive as Huber gives them in the lab, they might have lived longer. Buries their ashes, Huber does, at the end of the semester. Conventional interment. Bell, book, and clergy. Contends that these paupers and idiots and criminals, however much they may have been burned in their communities where they lived, have so completely discharged their obligation to society by their service in the lab that they deserve honorable burial. Fine old boy is Huber, believe me. The talk shifted to Nancy's affairs. She admitted she was worried. Rumor had it that Joyce Hudson was quite out of bounds, that Mrs. Hudson apparently could do nothing with her anymore. She was being seen at the wrong places, with the wrong people.
Do you suppose there is anything you could do about it, Bobby? Joyce is still your friend, isn't she?
I presume. His tone lacked interest. I haven't seen her for nearly a year, you know.
It may be just a notion of time, Bobby, but I always thought Joyce was a little in love with you.
His gesture denied it. She isn't. But suppose she was. Would that be a good reason for my mixing in over there? I'm not in love with her. No, I don't believe my obligation to Dr. Hudson involves my serving in loco parentis to his daughter.
I'm not so sure it doesn't, reflected Nancy. You've had an ambition to finish out his life for him, and part of his job was Joyce. There were times when all of his job was Joyce. You find no idea how much he gave up for her. Why, he even married to keep her straight.
That shouldn't have been much of a sacrifice, Bobby grinned.
Have you ever seen her since
Never tried to.
Still think about her sometimes?
Why do you want to know? His tone hinted that he would like to close the door between them, not rudely, but to close it, nevertheless, and prompt to feel it. Nancy disclaimed her right to inquire.
Forgive me, won't you? I haven't anything to do, you know, but amuse myself wondering about things like that.
Then I mustn't do you out of occupation. Nancy hung their coats in the closet, drew up a chair beside him, and together they faced the book again, agreeing that she should read the script, letter by letter, while Bobby arranged it into words. First, let me finish telling you the part I already deciphered. Randolph pointed to the epitaph and inquired, "How do you like this one?" "Means nothing to me," replied Dr. Hudson. "If there is a God, he probably has no more interest in any man's so-called victory, which can always be circumstantially explained, than in the victory of a cabbage that does well in a favorable soil." "Then you're related to God, same as the cabbage," chuckled Randolph. "That's good." He resumed his work, deftly chapping his chisel. "I used to think that," he went on, taking half to himself. "Made a little experiment and changed my mind about it." Put down his mallet, leaned far forward, and cupping his mouth with both hands, confided in a mysterious tone, "I've been on the line."
"He must have been crazy,"
Nancy muttered. "Tut, tut! What's come of your genius theory? You're willing Dr. Hudson should be one. Why not Randolph?"
"Quite right. Go on. But he does sound a little off, doesn't he?"
"Decidedly. And dangerously, I should say. The most cold-blooded, calculating, sacrilegious lunatic you ever met. I'll show you. Here's my exact copy of the translation. Listen to this. He did not have the tone or stance of a fanatic, spoke quietly, had none of the usual tricks by which aberrations are readily identified, talked well, with an absolute self-containment. Victory? Well, rather. I now have everything I want and can do anything I wish. So can you. So can anybody. All you have to do is follow the rules. There's a formula, you know. I came upon it by accident." He took up his chisel again. He was a queer one. I felt shy and embarrassed. Clearly he was cracked, but his manner denied it. I tried to remember he was an artist, with permission to be eccentric, but this was more than eccentricity. He made me shivery. I wanted to get away, so I was backing through his doorway when he called, "Doctor, do you have victory?" "Victory over what?" I demanded impatiently. I had not told him I was discouraged, hadn't mentioned I was a doctor. I never did find out how he guessed that, the question being eclipsed by more important discoveries. "Oh, over anything. Everything. Listen." He climbed swiftly down from his scaffolding and, gliding stealthily toward me as if he had some great secret to impart, he whispered into my ear, his hand firmly gripping my coat lapel, somewhat to my own anxiety. "Would you like to be the best doctor in this town?" So then I knew he was crazy, and I began tugging myself loose. "Come to my house tonight about 9 o'clock, he said, handing me his card, "and I'll tell you what you want to know." I must have looked dazed, for he laughed hilariously as he climbed up again. I laughed, too, as I reached the street, the epitaph matter having completely left my mind for the time. I never heard so much nonsense in my life. "Like hell," I growled, as I started my car. "Will I waste an evening with a fool?"
"This writing is authentic, Bobby."
At 9 o'clock I was at Randolph's door. When these words are read, I shall be unable to answer any queries as to my motive in going there that night. And that will be fortunate, for I have no explanation further than to say, and this will unquestionably be regarded with distrust and disappointment, that I was propelled there against my wishes. I had no thought of going, went in response to some urge over which I had no control. I was downtown to dinner that evening, returned home at 8, went immediately to bed, quite contrary to my custom, for I never retired before midnight, and began reading a book, unable to concentrate on the line of it. I could not keep my eyes off the clock. It ticked louder and louder. My heart beat faster and faster until the two of them seemed synchronized. At length, becoming so nervous I could no longer contain myself, I rose, dressed hastily, dashed out for my car, and drove to Randolph's address without regard to boulevard stops or angry traffic officers. My mouth was dry, my heart thumping. "How do you like it, as far as we've gone?" he asked. Nancy's elbows rested heavily on the desk, her clenched fists digging deeply in her cheeks.
"Why, Bobby, isn't this just awful?" she whispered. "It's tragic."
"You'll think so presently. It hasn't begun to get awful yet." His eyes traveled back to his copy. "You had not intended to come, had you?" inquired Randolph, taking my hat. "No," I replied sourly. "That's what I feared," he said gently. "But I felt so sure you needed to have a talk with me that I—" "That is what I want to know," I demanded. "What did you do?" He grinned slyly, rubbed his hands together satisfiedly, and said, "Well, I earnestly wanted here. And as I told you this morning, whatever I earnestly want, it comes. I wanted you here. You came." He motioned me to a seat. I was glad enough to accept it, for my knees were wobbly, in a living room furnished in exquisite taste. His daughter, whom he had gracefully presented, promptly excused herself and left us alone. Offering me a cigar, he leisurely filled a long-stemmed churchwarden pipe for himself and drew his chair closer. In his velvet jacket, at his ease, he was all artist, quite drizzled, wore a short Van Dyke beard, had a clear, clean, gray eye that came at you a bit shyly and tentatively, but left you no way of escape. He lost no time in preliminary maneuvers. Reaching to a small book table at his elbow, he took up a limp leather Bible. I knew then I was in for it. Impetuously, I resolved upon an immediate, if inglorious, exit. Savagely, I put up a protesting hand and said firmly, "Now, if it's that, I don't care to hear about it."
"See?" shouted Nancy. "What did I tell you?"
To my surprise, he put the book back on the table and calmly puffed at his pipe, thoughtfully for a while, then replied, "Well, neither am I, except as it's really an important history of a great religious system. Quite useful, I presume, but I'm not specially interested in it, except one page." He blew a few smoke rings, his head tilted far back against his tall chair. "And I have cut that page out. I just wanted you to see this particular copy of the Bible. I was about to say, when you plunged in with your impatient remark, that this copy of the Bible lacks the secret formula for power. I keep that one page elsewhere." "What's on it?" I inquired, annoyed at my own confession of interest. "Oh," he replied casually, "it's just the rules for getting whatever you want and doing whatever you wish to do and being whatever you like to be. But you're not interested in that, so we'll talk about something else." "What is on that page?" I demanded, my voice sounding rather shrill. "Do you really want to know?" he challenged, leaning forward and fixed me intently with his gaze. "Yes," I barked. His next words came slowly, incisively, single file. "More than you ever wanted to know anything before?" "Yes," I admitted and meant it. "Say it," he commanded. I repeated, "More than I have ever wanted to know anything before." His manner changed instantly. "Good. Now we can talk." He went down to an inside pocket and produced a Morocco wallet. From the wallet he extracted a folded page. I read it, and he carefully interpreted his meaning. Nancy's eyes were a study when Bobby stopped reading to search her face. "Are you prepared now for a complete knockout?" he inquired. "If so, I'll give you the next paragraph." I did not leave Randolph's house until 4 o'clock, and when I finally went out into the dark, considerably shaken, I was aware that my life would never be the same again. Whatever of success had come to me in my profession dates from that hour and can be explained in terms of the mysterious potentiality which Randolph communicated to me that night. There was a long silence between them. "That's almost as far as I've gone," said Bobby.
"Far enough, I should say."
Nancy's deep sigh was ominous of dejection. "Then let's call it a day." He rose and glanced at his watch. "You and I you can't help knowing that this is something Dr. Hudson must have written when he was under heavy pressure at work, half dead on his feet, seeing things, hearing voices. Perhaps we shouldn't be reading it at all. Maybe it isn't fair to his memory. How about giving it up and forgetting we ever went this far?" Nancy tapped the table thoughtfully with her fingertips.
I wonder what was on that page.
He laughed. That sounds like Dr. Hudson. That's what he wanted to know. Now it's your question. I'm about to confess I'd like to know too. He gripped her arm in strong fingers. And no matter how stiffly we revolt against this thing, we're sure to be sneaking back to it one at a time to investigate. So perhaps we should be honest with each other and look into it now. Are you willing? She nodded without looking up. Take warning. It's likely to make us as nutty as he was. Lighting a cigarette, Bobby strolled to the window, hands in pockets. He turned and, leaning on the windowsill, faced her studiously. Not me. I'm not going to do it. I can't afford to dabble in such stuff. It isn't good for me. I had no idea I could be so impressionable toward this sort of thing. You can go into it if you want. I'm out. He dismissed it peremptorily, with widespread fingers. Nancy's voice was husky.
You'll not be able to get away from it. You're too far in, and you know it. It's got you. I know it's got me. I understand now why he went to the Randolph house that night. There's something sort of inevitable about it. A form of insanity, maybe, but once it beckons to you, it's got you. You may as well come along first as last. It is curious, invisible tentacles that reach out and wrap their feelers about you and draw you up and into and drag you along.
Stop it, Nancy. It's ridiculous.